Next up, we're going to be installing the Torx Oil Filter Relocation Adapter plate. This is probably one of our most favorite products. The ability to adapt from the factory position with the factory bolt holes instead of the other ones you see on the market that thread on with a single stud. They often loosen off when you loosen your oil filter off. They leak. They don't really provide the level of OEM capable sealer sensor provisions or I guess any peripherals. So this adapter has oil pressure, oil temp. It also allows you to run the factory oil temperature and factory oil pressure alongside of that, so you can still retain your factory gauges. So we're going to go ahead, we're just going to assemble and talk about all the components you need to actually install this properly. So the first thing we're going to talk about, the oil filter bypass valve that is found in any RB that does not have an oil cooler. This is often overlooked when you're replacing the factory oil cooler or removing it and installing something like this, or just putting the oil filter directly under the block. This is going to allow any required oil flow to the main line of the block. The RB oil filter does not have a bypass valve in it, and contrary to popular belief, the oil filter does not flow all of the oil through the filter element. It does allow filter to bypass in other manufacturers. RB does not have that valve in it, so this is the valve that's required. If you do not use this on this block, oil pressure will be lower behind the oil filter, potentially leading to failure or severe damage, if not complete failure eventually. So what we've already done in previous videos here is we have drilled out this hole here. Some RB blocks just have a plug. Some RB blocks are not drilled all the way through. So the first thing we did before we did anything else in this block, before we cleaned it, we drilled that hole out. So now that we have it all assembled and prepped and cleaned, we're going to go ahead, we're going to press this valve into here. Now this valve doesn't require any sealant because the valve itself doesn't have anywhere to leak to. It's not going to be a big issue if it seals around the outside or not, as long as it doesn't move inside of there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just take a 10 mil socket. It fits perfectly over top of this fitting here, and we're just going to hammer it down into place. Okay, it's bottomed out in the block now. Now in here, because you're hammering metal into metal, and it isn't an oil filter, an oil location, you're going to want to make sure that you clean out any debris that's in here. So I'm just going to go ahead, just going to step in front of you, and I'm just going to take out a microfiber just to grab any metal debris that might be in or around the space. Make sure we don't end up with any unwanted debris in there. Okay, and then next up we're going to be installing the oil cooler stud. This allows an O-ring to seal along this surface here, not allowing oil to bypass past the oil cooler and the oil filter. So we're just going to go ahead, we're going to install that in there just like that. Again, no sealant required in here. It does allow for a little bit of a leak. And then to tighten it, I just take a pry bar, fit in there like that. Just turn it until it's snug. Not a lot of torque required to tighten that down. You're just going to want to make sure it's snug. So just to talk about a little bit about what happens in here. So the oil comes from the pickup into the oil pump, through the oil pump into this gallery here. Then the oil comes into this chamber here. This pressurizes and then feeds it into the oil cooler, which would be this outside port in the Torx oil filter adapter. Goes into the oil cooler, comes out of the oil cooler, into the filter, out of the filter, and then back in through the center port here. So what will happen is if you require more oil than the oil filter allows filtered, this valve will open and it'll allow oil flow into the main gallery of the block, and it'll provide oil to crankshaft, rods, just like anything would be required in a normal engine, and pretty much guarantees that there's no lack of oil. In a perfect world, yes, all oil is filtered, but the filter element simply cannot flow enough through it to supply the engine at any given pressure. So at a certain point, certain pressure, this valve will open and allow oil to flow into the block and lubricate the engine itself. So next up here, we're just going to go ahead, we're going to install the O-rings, and then we'll install the adapter plate. Okay, so first thing we're going to do now with this Torx adapter plate, the center O-ring The center O-ring is going to seal on this stud here, just like that. And then that seals the two chambers from each other and allows the oil to flow to the oil cooler. So this seal here, just like on the factory oil cooler, just goes right in the middle. There is a little bit of a groove in here that we're going to have to get this O-ring into. Now I do add a little bit of oil just because it will slide onto the stud a lot nicer. Okay, and the next O-ring we're going to be installing is just on the outside here. Just presses into the groove really nicely. This is a very well made piece. And then you can apply just a little bit of oil onto that seal just to get it to not stick to the metal if it does have to be shifted left or right. You want it to be able to seal nicely, just like you would an oil filter. When you tighten an oil filter down, you want to make sure you have a little bit of lubrication on there so it does not grab the metal, possibly rip it. So now that we have all of those two seals installed, we're going to go ahead, we're going to install the bolts in the plate. Okay, so torque spec for this is going to be, again, 15 to 18. Anywhere in between there, it'll be okay. Now that we have the adapter installed, we're just going to go ahead and install the AN fittings. Again, just a little bit of oil on the seals just to allow it to install and seal nicely. Okay, so because we're going to be just installing this plug for now, our client will be installing the oil temperature sensor when he does receive his engine. But this plug that they do provide with you is the only plug that will seal the factory oil temperature hole. This seals on the chamfer here on the plug and not actually on the threads. This is not a tapered plug. So this requires, or this particular hole requires this plug or the sensor itself. You cannot put anything else in here. So in order to plug this, you would need to have this plug or the sensor itself. So don't go ahead. They do provide other NPT plugs, so you can't just put those into this particular hole. Okay, so additionally, with the Torx adapter plate, they do include the three plugs here, the tapered plugs. They are going to be just temporarily installed on this particular build. Our client is going to be using the factory oil pressure sensor. He will have oil temperature and oil pressure as well. So we're just going to go ahead, we're just going to temporarily install these. Just going to put them snug. I'm going to put a note on them that they are not permanently installed for him, and when he does go to install his sensors, these will be removed. Okay, now that we have everything installed here, I'm just going to cover the ports with tape so we don't get any debris in there. Okay, so now that we have the Torx adapter installed, you can go ahead, you can move on to whatever else you have to do with your oil cooler setup or oil filter relocation. Again, note the oil filter bypass in here is critical. Don't ever overlook that step. I have heard of people who have installed that and said they have had no issues, and then shortly followed by an engine failure that they say they don't know why. Just always make sure that that is installed in there. If your block does require that hole to be drilled and you do have an engine installed in the car, you'll have to make the call on that and what you want to do. Drilling it can cause issues, so I don't recommend doing that, but you'll definitely have to think about what you're going to do there correctly, whether it is to use it or not use it. This is available on our website if you do want to purchase one, along with the oil filter relocate as well. So next up on the RB, we're going to be doing the oil restrictor and oil block off plug. The restrictor itself on this block, we're going to be using the 1.1. For the type of driving he's going to be using, that'll be a good setup for him. The restrictor itself goes into the front of the block, first hole, and then the block off plug itself is going to go into the rear. These are always removed when we machine an engine. Again, you can get debris trapped below them, behind them. If it does come loose after machining, you won't know. So we do remove these, and we do replace these on every engine we do. So the block pressure or oil block off one here is just going to be installed in the rear of the engine. The reason there is two is because other RBs have hydraulics have hydraulic valve train that requires more oil supply. So an RB25 will have an oil feed in both of these, whereas the 26, 25 Neo have solid lifters, so they only have one feed. And then when you're doing a performance build, you're going to need to reduce the amount of oil flow to the cylinder head because the engine is going to be living in a higher RPM. So that is why we reduce the size of the restrictor to limit the amount of oil flow at higher RPM. So we're going to go ahead, we're going to install the block off one. In order to install these, you basically just hammer them until they're flush with the deck surface. There, that one's flush with the deck surface there. Should be a nice snug fit in the block, press fit. Now we're going to be moving on to the oil feed. This goes in the front of the block, we've already stated. Again, we're just going to hammer that down until it's flush with the top of the block. I'm just using a punch and a hammer. Very nice. Okay, so for this one here on the oil feed, this actually comes up through the cylinder head stud and into the block that's cross drilled. So you're going to always want to make sure that this hole in particular is very, very clean. The oil stud hole, or the cylinder head stud hole, needs to be clean. The stud itself needs to be clean. We'll get to that when we actually install the cylinder head. But just make sure for now that this area is very clean, the hole is clean, and then when you install it, it's either flush to the block or just below the block. Totally fine. Okay, so we're going to be moving on to installing the RB water pump. This is the R32 specific water pump. You can see how here it's not slotted. We did talk about that in our water pump video, so you want to check that one out just to see the differences. That's what I'm talking about there. So this one just directly fits perfectly onto this block, onto the 10 mil hole here. So what we're going to do here is basically a brand new setup, not a lot of cleaning required. We're just going to prep our surfaces with the rubbing alcohol again, make sure everything's clean, do the pump, do the block. We have all new hardware to go with this, so it's going to be quite nice. I like to spread the silicone out again just to make sure it's contacting all the surfaces. Sometimes you can end up with the silicone just bridging over the surface, and then you go to put it on and it sags, and then it creates a hole that can leak. So now that we know that it's completely covered, we have her applied on all surfaces. I'm going to go ahead and install the top middle ones. Again, I like to install the bolt before I press it against the block just to make sure it's centered as close as possible into where it needs to be, and you're not dragging the silicone around on the surface of the block, potentially causing areas where it could leak. Once you have all your water pump hardware installed, just want to note these two here, there is going to be an alternator bracket of some kind on your setup. Our client already has his PRP alternator kit, so he does not have that in Calgary. That's at his location. So he'll be reinstalling that kit with different hardware when he does receive his engine. These are just going to be placeholders for now. Make sure we install the water pump and get all of the silicone sealed and set. But for now, we're just going to move on and we're going to talk about the torque specs. There is a torque pattern on this. It is going to be these 4 big ones first, and then you're going to move on to the medium-sized bolts and then the M6 bolt last. The 4 larger bolts are 31 foot-pounds. The smaller 12mm heads are going to be a 15 to 18 foot-pound again, and then the smaller one here is going to be a 6 to 8 foot-pound. So we're going to go ahead, we're just going to start with this first one here. So we're just going to start at the bottom one here. 31 foot-pounds for the larger 14mm head bolts. And then we're going to go to the top one here. Just cross down to the bottom one. Okay, and then the factory service manual does tell you to kind of go in a circle here around the pump. So we're just going to repeat that. Again, 15 to 18 foot-pounds. For the water pump, I like to do 18, just because we're dealing with coolant. We don't want to have any sort of coolant leaks this far into the engine. It does become a bit of a nightmare to repair this, timing belt off, etc. Okay, once you have those torqued up, again, we can torque this smaller M6 bolt down. That one is going to be a 6 to 8 foot-pound, I think I said there. So I'll just usually land around 7. Good to go. And then once they're all tight, I'll go around again. Same torque specifications. Okay, and then once you have them all torqued, paint pen, in case you walk away. And water pump installed. Okay, so next up we're going to be doing the timing pulleys and the ARP idler bolt and tensioner stud. The stud that we sell in our kit requires a bit of modification. ARP doesn't actually make the stud. We just buy it and we instruct on how to modify it. So we're going to be doing the modification of this stud here. This is the factory one, you can see here. And then this is the ARP one. Now this is a bit of a slight of a difference on it. So what we do when we modify these is I like to cut the end off so that the base of the shank on the stud lines up with the base of the shank on the OEM one. That way when you tighten in the block, it stays nice and snug. So what we're going to do, just going to mark the thread that we'll be cutting between, just like that. Again, we're just lining up these two here. And then we're going to take this. So yeah, I like to place it in the vise, use a rag so you don't damage the other side. Get it pretty snug in there, and then I like to use a hacksaw. This just guarantees control. You're not going to be melting the stud with a grinder, trying to cut through there and then creating a big sharp edge. So we'll just go ahead, we're just going to cut the tip off in between the threads we marked. So now that we've cut it, you can see we haven't even cleaned the threads up yet, but the thread itself looks pretty good with the hacksaw. Like, you're not going to end up with it melting over the other threads and damaging the rest of the stud. So that's why we like to use the hacksaw. I'm just going to clean this up now with the belt sander, and I'll show you the finished chamfer product. Okay, so now we've cleaned it up on the belt sander. We've got a nice clean edge that isn't going to catch when you go to thread it in. The start of the thread is not melted or folded over, and just ends up with a good result without having any other problems to deal with. Now compared to the factory stud again, we got our lengths to thread right about the same. So now we can go ahead, we'll put a bit of Loctite on the stud itself, we'll install it in the block. Okay, so just a dab of Loctite, and then we're just going to install it into the block. Again, we have cut this stud so it bottoms out in the block just like the factory one does, and you can get it nice and snug, just like the OEM stud would be. Once you have it installed, you can remove the excess Loctite. You don't want that sitting behind the pulley when you go to install it. Okay, so next up we're going to be doing the timing tensioner spring rest stud. This rests on the block, just holding the tension on the spring of the pulley here. So we're going to go ahead, we're just going to use 2 M6 nuts, tighten down on the stud here so we can install it in the block. Again, I like to use a little Loctite on here just so it doesn't back out if the stud falls out. No harm, no foul for the tension, but if it goes through the timing belt, you're going to have big problems. Okay, once you have the stud shank base fully seated in the block there, you can go ahead and you can remove your M6 nuts from the stud. Okay, so this kit, stud kit and idler bolt, both available on our website. I do recommend using it on any mildly built RB or any older RB. The stud itself is the critical component. It does often fail when you torque it down. So I do recommend at a minimum doing the stud. But they are available on our website if you do decide to move forward with one of those. Okay, now for the last piece of the puzzle on this block here, we're just going to be installing the rear main oil gallery plug. Same as the front one. We're just going to apply the purple Loctite in the center of the plug. And then we're just going to thread this in here. A little bit tricky on the stand, but possible.
My garage is, but I don't do enough production welding to
So once you have your plug installed, just again make sure flush with the back of the block. This one does interfere with the dust plate that goes for the transmission, so if it does protrude at all, it will push the plate out and it will hit the flywheel. So we don't want that. Make sure it's flush with the block, and then that'll be the last plug we do. Okay, so if you've watched up to this point, you've pretty much seen every step of the way of this block build. from bare block all the way to complete assembly now. We're going to move on now with the rest of this project into a separate chain of videos for the cylinder head, and then we'll move into the final assembly of the engine, and then we'll send this off to our client here, and hopefully he has a good time with it.